Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Mark has always had a centered personality. Discreet, observant, one of those who prefer to listen before offering an opinion. He met Rachel at a corporate event in Boston, one of those networking gatherings between companies for closing partnerships. She arrived wearing a simple red dress and an easy smile. While many discussed market goals and growth charts, Rachel preferred to talk about travel, literature, and classical music. Mark was intrigued by the contrast between her confident appearance and a certain mystery in her gaze. She spoke with a charming lightness, as if the world around her didn't weigh her down. They exchanged contacts that night, and a week later they were having their first dinner together. The involvement between them happened quickly, but with the illusion of balance. Rachel appeared extremely charismatic, the kind who wins anyone over with just a few words. She had strong opinions, a firm stance, but claimed to be romantic and a dreamer. She told stories from her childhood, talked about her desire to have children, and described in detail how she imagined growing old alongside someone with whom she could share her life. Mark believed every word. 6 months later, they were living together. 2 years after that, they were married. It was one of those marriages that seemed correct, aligned. They had financial stability, bought a comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood, where they planned to see their children grow up. Rachel worked in advertising and was always surrounded by creative people, dynamic projects, and lots of social events. Mark worked as a financial analyst at an investment firm. The two seemed to function as a team. They split the bills, supported each other's goals, traveled on vacations, and spent holidays with their respective families. From the outside, everything seemed perfect. But inside, certain gaps started to appear. Rachel had a constant need for validation. She always wanted to be the center of attention, the highlight of any setting. Mark, in his usual calm manner, let her. He believed that part of love was admiring the other person, letting them shine. But gradually, he noticed that her brilliance seemed to depend on external looks, especially those coming from men. He began to notice small details. Rachel would dress up excessively for meetings with colleagues but wore basic clothes for dinners with him. She said she was too tired for conversations at night but spent hours on calls with friends or coworkers from the agency. Over time, she stopped asking for his opinion on important decisions, responded to comments with sarcasm, and during arguments, made jokes that seemed harmless but carried subtle insults. Mark tried to balance things. He insisted on honest conversations, suggested small changes in their routine, proposed trips, romantic dinners, anything that might reconnect them. Rachel always smiled but gave vague answers. Sometimes she changed the subject, other times she seemed irritated, as if he were demanding too much. One day, he mentioned wanting to have children. Rachel fell silent, smiled as if hearing a joke, and changed the topic. Mark interpreted this as resistance, perhaps fear. But he chose to believe it was just a matter of time. Despite the signs, he clung to hope. He was convinced that every relationship goes through phases and that patience was proof of love. But as the months went by, the distance between them was no longer silent. It was felt in their bodies, in their gazes, in their dry words. Rachel seemed to live in another reality, one where Mark existed only as a social obligation. Still, he persisted. He thought about everything they had built together, the promises exchanged, the person she claimed to be when they first met. The image of that sweet and enchanting woman still lived inside him, even though it was far from the reality he faced. Mark clung to the past like someone holding onto an old photograph, believing it could still be real. He didn't see that time had already changed everything. While he tried to save what was left, Rachel had already turned the page without looking back. The estrangement between them stopped being a silent discomfort and became an open wound, bleeding every day with small actions that said more than any words. Rachel began extending her work hours frequently, always claiming urgent deadlines, impromptu meetings, or last-minute invitations to corporate dinners. Mark tried to believe, tried to trust, but her arguments sounded rehearsed. She no longer explained herself with the same care as before, speaking impatiently, as if justifying herself was a nuisance. During dinners, which now happened less often, she was always distracted. She'd arrive, take off her shoes, grab a glass of wine, and stay glued to her phone. The smile that used to be reserved for him now appeared when she read messages. Mark observed in silence. Sometimes he tried to start a conversation, ask about her day, or make a joke to lighten the mood. Rachel responded with short phrases, changed the subject, pretended to be tired, and retreated early. He resisted the urge to snoop through her phone, to follow her steps, or to confront her without evidence. He chose the path of honesty. One night, while she was preparing something in the kitchen, Mark took a deep breath and said exactly how he felt. That he felt excluded from her life. That he was there, ready to fight, but needed clarity. Rachel turned her face away, crossed her arms, and made a sarcastic comment about meaningless drama. When he mentioned the desire to start a family, to have a child with her, her response was a cold phrase, spoken without emotion, almost like a cut, "That's your problem." Mark stood there, looking at her as if facing a stranger. The woman with whom he had shared dreams now treated his feelings as an inconvenience. Still, he didn't give up. That same week, he spoke with a close couple of friends and asked for a therapist recommendation. He explained that he wanted professional help, that he believed it was still possible to rebuild their connection, to understand what was being lost. He scheduled a session with Dr. Cole Bennett, someone with an excellent reputation, known for working with couples in crisis. On the morning of the appointment, Rachel seemed distant but went along. In the car, the two stayed silent. Mark tried to hide his nervousness, hoping that this conversation with a professional would clear away the hurt. They arrived at the office a few minutes early. The receptionist led them to a small waiting room. The clock ticked 5, then 10 minutes. When the door finally opened, Dr. Bennett himself called them in. Mark stood up with hope. But as soon as they entered the room, everything changed. The therapist greeted them formally, but there was something strange in his gaze. Without warning, Dr. Bennett said that, for ethical reasons, he couldn't conduct the session. He apologized and asked them to leave. Rachel pressed her lips together, crossed her hands in her lap, and tried to hide her surprise. She gave a nervous smile and said it was fine. Mark was confused, not understanding anything. He asked if there was some mistake, but Dr. Bennett simply said he couldn't go into details. On the way home, Rachel commented that she thought all of it was unnecessary. She said it might be a sign that they were forcing something that no longer had a chance. Mark stayed silent. His mind kept going back to Bennett's expression, the hesitation in his words, the way Rachel had acted. Something was wrong. This wasn't just some random mishap. There was something behind the refusal, something no one had said out loud. The following days were colder than usual. Rachel dove deeper into excuses to be absent. Mark, on the other hand, began to look at their relationship from a different angle. It wasn't about saving the marriage anymore. It was about understanding the moment he started living with a woman who was no longer who she claimed to be. The missed therapy session became the silent marker of a truth beginning to unfold before him, even though some pieces of the puzzle were still missing. After that failed appointment, Mark felt consumed by a restlessness he could no longer ignore. The therapist's refusal seemed to have opened a door he had always avoided crossing. It wasn't just the frustration of losing an attempt to save the marriage. It was the way everything happened. The way Rachel masked her surprise. The discomfort in the therapist's eyes when he looked at him. Everything seemed scripted, as if he was the only one who hadn't received the script. The following days were filled with silence, but not a peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence that screams, that suffocates. Mark spent hours thinking about why he was still there. The answers he once sought in Rachel's actions, he now found in her absences. She was physically present but emotionally in another world. Her gaze passed through him without stopping. Conversations, when they happened, were automatic. Sometimes he said something, and she didn't even respond. She just tapped on her phone and muttered, "Uh-huh," without paying attention. He began observing more carefully. The constant messages, the hidden smiles, the tone of voice that changed when she spoke on the phone. He noticed that whenever the name, Cole, came up, whether in a news story, in a movie, or in a memory, Rachel would look away or change the subject too quickly. Mark wasn't the type of man to create theories without reason, but his instinct started speaking louder. Everything he felt seemed to align into a clear pattern. There was someone else. He didn't have proof, but he sensed it. One night, Rachel returned home around 11, claiming her boss had called an emergency meeting. Her hair was tied up in a style she rarely wore, and her makeup was still intact. When she walked in, she glanced at Mark and smiled. A forced smile, the kind offered out of obligation. He watched her for a few seconds before asking if everything was okay. Rachel said yes, grabbed a glass of wine, and said she needed to relax. That night, Mark slept on the couch. He pretended to fall asleep watching TV, but the truth was different. He didn't want to share a room with someone who seemed to carry another name in her thoughts. The next morning, Mark woke up before Rachel. He had a quick coffee, dressed quietly, and left for work as if it were just another ordinary day. But inside, he had already made his decision. He spent the entire day focused, sticking to the plan he had set since waking up. When the day ended, he drove back home and sat in his car for a few minutes, staring at what until then had been his life. He entered the house without making noise, went straight to the bedroom, packed his things, and on the dining table, he left a short letter and the divorce papers. He walked out for the last time without looking back. When Rachel got home later that evening, Mark wasn't there. The living room light was still on, giving the false impression he would return at any moment. But when she looked at the table, she saw the reality staring back at her. The divorce papers, signed by him, rested beside a folded letter with her name handwritten on it. She froze for a few seconds, staring at those documents as if they might disappear. The silence in the house felt heavier than ever. No sound, no movement, no personal explanation. Just her, and the traces of someone who chose to leave with dignity. The messages started in the middle of the night. First, an attempt to understand what had happened. Then came the calls, followed by long voice notes trying to explain, saying he was overreacting. Rachel said he had gone crazy, that all of this was in his head. She even said he was abandoning the marriage because of insecurity. But Mark was already in another city when he heard that. He rented a small apartment in Portland and took on a new project with a company that had offered him an opportunity months ago. In the first few days, he kept his phone turned off. He avoided social media. He avoided anything that connected him to his old life. Gradually, he found pleasure in simple things. A quiet coffee in the morning. Walks without a set schedule. He started sleeping better, eating better, breathing better. As painful as the breakup was, the weight he had carried for years seemed to have stayed attached to the ring that was no longer on his finger. The last time he heard Rachel's voice was in a message left on his voicemail. She cried and said he was destroying everything because of a misunderstanding. That they could start over. That no one knew him like she did. Mark didn't respond. He knew that any word spoken at that moment would drag him back into the chaos he had finally managed to escape. The process moved quickly. Rachel signed the papers a few days later, without objections. Her silence confirmed what he already knew, there was nothing left between them. Mark received the official divorce confirmation via email, accompanied by the administrative chill that contrasted with everything that marriage had once meant. There were no fights, no tears, no promises to reconsider. Just a dry full stop, like ending a contract that had lost its validity. 2 months later, Mark was settled in Portland, with a lighter routine and peace of mind. On a Friday night, he accepted an invitation from an old friend to grab a drink at a discreet bar, far from the places he used to frequent with Rachel. The conversation flowed between laughter and old memories until the friend, without any malice, dropped a sentence that erased the little doubt that remained. "Hey, I remembered you. Last week I went to dinner in Seattle, and guess who I saw leaving a fancy restaurant? Rachel. Holding hands with an elegant guy, light suit, polished demeanor. She looked very comfortable with him, like they'd been together for a while. And here's the funny part, it was that famous therapist, Cole something." Mark froze. The name hit him like a precise arrow, without a sound. The noises around him disappeared for a moment. His earlier laughter died in his throat. His body was still there, but his mind was transported back to that waiting room, to the day of the refusal, to Rachel's forced smile, to the coldness with which she turned her back on everything. As his friend continued talking, Mark leaned back in his chair and looked away. There was nothing left to ask. No detail would change what he now understood clearly. The intuition that once hurt as uncertainty now hurt as confirmation. She had already been involved with the therapist at the time of the appointment. She had already made her choice, she just lacked the courage to admit it. It was in that moment, without drama, without witnesses, that the wound healed. The lump in his throat turned into relief. The truth, as cruel as it was, liberated him. Everything finally made sense. The therapist who was supposed to help them was the same one Rachel hid between the lines of her routine. It wasn't coincidence, nor chance. It was a choice. Cold, calculated, and silent. And even if she never confessed, Mark already had all the answers he needed. Mark left that bar with steady steps but a quiet mind. There were no more questions, no dilemmas. It was as if all the pieces he had tried to fit together for years finally organized themselves on their own. The image of Rachel holding hands with Cole in public dissolved the last shred of hope he might have unknowingly held onto. And instead of anger, he felt relief. He no longer needed to look back expecting explanations. The explanation had already been given, even if in silence. On the way home, he thought about the nights he blamed himself. The moments he thought he demanded too much, that maybe he was failing as a husband. He remembered the days he tried to please, adjust routines, propose solutions. And now he understood that while he was trying to save a marriage, Rachel was already in another relationship. A silent parallel where he was just an obstacle to be maneuvered around. That realization made it clear that the biggest betrayal wasn't the touch of another person but the absence of truth. Rachel moved on before ending what existed between them. And by doing so, she took away his chance to fight with dignity. That night, Mark opened the window of his new apartment, took a deep breath, and watched the street activity. He thought about everything he had lived through with her. Not with nostalgia, but with acceptance. No action could erase the time they shared, the good moments, the plans made sincerely. But the pain of being abandoned inwardly, slowly, taught him more than any conversation. He learned that true love doesn't hide. It doesn't need excuses, long silences, or diverted eyes. Love stays. Love faces. Love respects. And maybe that was what hurt the most, realizing he had loved alone for much longer than he thought. But at the same time, that was what strengthened him. Because loving truly, even without being reciprocated, is never failure. Failure is lying, deceiving, manipulating someone who trusts you. Mark chose to be honest until the end. She chose to pretend until hiding was no longer possible. And as much as it hurt, that difference saved him. Life went on. He reconnected with old friends, started taking better care of his health and mind. He read books that had been sitting on the shelf for years. He met new people, exchanged long conversations, laughed again with lightness. He didn't immediately seek a new love, but he also didn't close the door to it. He understood that starting over doesn't require haste, just courage. And that time heals everything that is true, and destroys everything that is a lie. The last time he heard anything about Rachel, an acquaintance mentioned that she had moved to another city with Cole. They said he had quit his job at the clinic and started seeing private clients. Mark listened and just nodded. It no longer concerned his life. They had chosen their path, and he had chosen his. A clean, calm path, where every step was taken consciously. And even though it had started with pain, that path led him to the only direction that mattered, peace of mind.
Suspicious of your wife or daughter-in-law? Don't go through what we saw in the video. Check the link in the comments and get the ebook with valuable tips and investigator-approved sites to clear your doubts.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.